Hello, everybody. Welcome to this lundis INED, organized by the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population. The talk is on assessing the state of urban science in contemporary global policy debates. I'm Mary Ellen Zupin, and I'm the Union's Executive Director here at the INED at the IUSSP Secretariat. Each year, we try to organize one lundis INED featuring the research of an IUSSP member. This year, we're featuring the work of people who are part of an IUSSP scientific panel on fertility, family planning, and urban development. And our speaker is Dr. Susan Parnell. She's a professor of demography, human demography at the University of Bristol, and she's an emeritus professor at the University of Cape Town. And she's part of she's the Global Challenges Research Professor in the School of Geography at the University of Bristol. She's author of numerous publications that document how cities, past and present, respond to policy change. Our discussant is Trudy Harpham, Emeritus Professor of Urban Development and Policy at the London South Bank University, and Honorary Professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. They've been both involved in the IUSSP panel on fertility, family planning, and urban development. Trudy's co-chair of that panel. The panel has been guiding a fellowship program on urban family planning that's been funded by a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that started in 2018. The grant has been funding research by 15 early career scholars based in Africa to conduct policy-relevant research on fertility and family planning in urban environments in Africa, and provided training for policy engagement and communication to give fellows the tools to engage with policymakers on contributions to family planning in their cities and their contributions to both urban development and sustainability. We've all been really, Susan has intervened in quite a number of occasions for us on this panel, and we've always been really impressed with her discussions about urban development, the contributions that demographers might make, and especially how scientists might better contribute to policy discussions on urban development and how demographers might do that. And so I thought this would be a really interesting, she has a lot of interesting information that's really relevant for the work that demographers are doing in the area. And so with that, I leave it to Sue to give us her talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it's really lovely to be here, especially because the sun is actually shining as we are sitting here. I know there are people online, and I'm not 100%. That's one of the cameras up there, is it?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so we wave if we want to make eye contact.
Yes.
Up there. Good. Thank you, everybody. If I'm speaking too fast and you want me to slow down, just tell me, okay? If you want to prepare your headspace for what I'm going to talk about, just a couple of things which you might want to carry in the back of your mind. One is the question of what does it mean to be a demographer or population studies person who works at the urban scale. Okay. The second is, what does it mean to study populational demography in the 21st century, given that it is a global majority? And the third is, what does it really mean to think about these kinds of questions in the lead up to 2030? And the Sustainable Development Goals. So that kind of informs, but is not to the fore of everything that I'll talk about. I'll pick up on those points, but it's a kind of, what do you bring into the room with you, if you like? Okay. Whoa, exciting. There you go. And I think, just by way of context, I think what's really important about this first slide is not only the point that we live in a majority urban world, we know that. But if you look at what is sometimes called the first wave of urbanization, where you move from 1750 to 1950 at a relatively stable rate of change, and we know that's associated with really dramatic social and economic shifts of industrialization. Few hundred years, we moved to 420 million people living in cities, 52%, that majority tipping point, which was so important for shifting the debate. But if you think about what's going to happen over the next period of time, and you think about how dramatically different that is in pace and in volume of the number of people who are going to be coming to live in cities, that figure on the right, and you think about the very different nature of the places where this urban transition is going to take place, you begin to realize that we've got a real challenge on our hands. Not only is this of an order of magnitude different from what has gone before, but also we can't just repeat what we did before. It's not good enough. Okay? It's not going to work. It's just a fundamentally different challenge. And I think there are a lot of people who've acknowledged this. There's a widespread recognition of the problem, even if we don't really fully yet understand what it is that we're going to do about it. I'll just give you some idea of some of the responses which have come and already been put in place, the acknowledgement, if you like, that we now live in a global urban world. And therefore, everything that we think about and everything we advocate doesn't have to be only centered on cities, of course not, but it must work in these cities that are the frontier of the second phase of urbanization. And we've seen that happening. So if you look at any of the statements that came out of the 2030 agenda, either directly in the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 11, the urban one, or the wider policy documents that are associated with it, the New Urban Agenda, for example, an explicit kind of recognition of that reality. We know that big, really powerful statements like the IPCC, you would have heard the news today of that last and final summary report coming out of IPCC 6. Cities are acknowledged. We know that this is an important domain. They had a specific focus in the 2015 Paris Agreement, the acknowledgement that how cities are built and run is really going to be the litmus test of whether we get emissions right or not. Cities also featured very prominently in the COP, the biodiversity COP last year in Montreal. And cities are seen not just as a source of the biodiversity problem, but potentially also of its solution. And if you work in the domain of health, you will know that the global health agenda, sometimes people talk about One Health, sometimes they talk about planetary health, but the urban focus has assumed much, much greater prominence than it has done in years to come. So nobody's saying we're not doing anything. The question is, are we doing the right things? Are we doing enough of it? And can we refine what we are doing? And what I wanted to talk about today is really some of the scholarship rather than the policy that is associated with this, and which is tied up in part with the idea of a new urban science. Now, urban science means different things to different people. I'm going to talk a little bit about a multidisciplinary, one might argue, a multifaceted understanding of urban science, which is both what some people would call urban data analytics in its narrowest sense, but is also a much wider understanding of cities as metabolic processes, as metabolic systems, and as complex and open systems. And it's that I want to focus on today, partly because it seems to me that if we are to make a significant difference as scientists seeking to influence policy over the next decade, decade and a half, we are going to have to galvanize, to come together around a core practice. And it's probably going to be called something like urban science. And so getting our heads around what that means, what it means to contribute, and what it might mean for you as demographers seeking to reflect on the way that science is being undertaken at the moment is probably quite useful. I want to draw our attention to 4 attributes of what I think are the characteristics of urban science. And this comes out of some work with colleagues that is under review at the moment. I mean, I think the first thing which is true and is different from when the narrow argument about we live in an urban world, more than 1 in 2 of us live a majority urban world. There's now a much more nuanced argument where cities are seen as complex adaptive systems. In other words, they operate as part of a system of systems. So the laws which invoked in the understanding of urbanization and of cities themselves are scaling laws about increasing scale and returning to scale, laws of flows, laws of stocks. And this is not a static understanding. I think that's what's really important. It's a much more complex understanding associated with the kinds of theories which come out of complex systems thought. And associated with that is the idea of a temporality and a spatiality, as well as a statistical understanding, and the ability to bring those things together. And that's helped very much to understand not just individual cities, which are made up of lots of component parts, which are all interconnected in a metabolic way, but also to understand the way that cities connect to each other and the way that cities connect into planetary dynamics in significant kinds of ways. So that very complex theoretical understanding, often associated with some complex modeling, and we might argue perhaps problematically apolitical. Let's come back to that in a minute. But nonetheless, what we've certainly seen is the rise of that kind of science, a really dramatic expansion, and an attention to cities from a community who never really used to focus on cities before. That's the first thing. I think the second thing which characterizes urban science is this concern with sustainability issues and with these coupled, what are called sometimes coupled socio-ecological systems, where you don't see things as purely nature or as somehow social or political or economic, but not in some senses embedded in nature. Some of you may come out of a political ecology tradition as part of that, but certainly this idea that informed the 2030 agenda in much more radical kinds of ways, the introduction of this link to nature. You see that in all sorts of ways. The IPCC has it. I already talked about the biodiversity report conference last year that had similar kinds of ideas. And it's this notion that urban risks are associated with not just heat extremes, increased air pollution, but also with questions of governance, okay? That these things are in some way or another way connected. And I think what's fascinating for the scientist and challenging is the way that this puts this nexus, if you like, between health, infrastructure, demography, and to some extent climate, or to a large extent climate as well, brings us to the fore of what we might be studying. So thinking about the urban world, the urban population, the balance of climatic systems, the challenges of urban health, whether those are infectious diseases or whether they are non-communicable diseases, would have the same kinds of consequences. So this coupled systems. Then I think the third attribute, if you like, of this new urban science is that it's drawing data from places that they weren't before, okay? And that's deeply significant, not just because we've got the proliferation of data and the proliferation of the capacity to analyze that data, because we've got much, much bigger computational resources. And you've seen some of the best resourced universities and clusters in the world putting a lot of money, I mean, like a lot of money, into the analysis of this kind of data. But what I would highlight here is not just the rise of data capacity and of new data and of the capacity to integrate data, but importantly, the ability to get data on places and from places that we never had data on before. We're no longer reliant on surveys and censuses. So some fantastic work coming out of Chicago, for example. Louis Pedincourt's work looking at what you can say about Africa on the basis of satellite imagery, Karen Tito in the Yale lab doing much of the same kinds of things, and then hubs within the African continent itself, beginning to look at what the GCRO, the Gauteng Regional Observatory, for example, finding all sorts of new ways of representing places. And what that's doing is it's helping us to reconfigure what we know about particular places, but also what we know about the composite of cities, okay? Because instead of ignoring half of the map and half of the urban population, we actually now are able to make it visible, to make it legible. And that seems to me to be a very significant change. And then finally, I think there's an institutional challenge to us, which is that recent work has got to be multidisciplinary, okay? Which is not to say that, you know, I'm a geographer, that mapping is irrelevant. Of course, it's absolutely fundamental. You're an ethnographer, an anthropologist. These are different ways of knowing. Statistical ways of knowing remain absolutely fundamental, but these things have to come together with a range of different kinds of techniques as we begin to look at creating new communities of scholarly practice to engage with different kinds of policymakers. Okay, so that's quite fragile because we're doing a lot of things which are more complicated, dependent on more actors, and have to engage with people who are doing the same, looking at new problems at a faster pace in institutional contexts that are not that good. And so I want to suggest to you that it's not just those intellectual challenges that are so demanding, tricky, but important, but it's also that we have to simultaneously, as thought leaders, come to terms with the fact that we have to be able to make a clear case about what the science is saying and who and how it needs to be taken up. So the political recognition that urban science is really important. I'd give you the example of health. The health community and the health sciences community have been really good about establishing their presence, about demonstrating the value of peer review, of trials, of what evidence counts. They've got really established practices, and those conduits are well oiled. We are nowhere near creating those kinds of robust platforms and conduits, and we probably need to move to think to that. Part of that, we've had a recent paper come out in one of the Nature journals, Nature Communications, which argues that urban science is transforming knowledge, but if we're to be effective, one of the things we're going to have to do is to be much punchier and clearer about what the urban agenda is. In other words, the first generation, if you like, of the claims of urban science was that you needed to focus on cities, and probably that you needed to focus on the cities of the South, which were growing faster and were going to be more important. But now it seems to us that you need to make the next generation of claims. We need, if we're going to maintain the potency of the messages of an urban science, it seems that we have to update some of what we're saying. And we need to beginning to put the spotlight on how to govern these complex urban dynamics. And we need to make sure that we're able to speak to global stakeholders to be able to articulate how and why and where their responsibilities might lie. We probably have to engage in some self-organization in order to do that, and that's probably overdue. The kinds of messages that I would suggest and that we have suggested in that commentary piece that you might want to have a quick look at, it's only a 2-pager, but I'll give you the abstract effectively here, is that we have to update our understanding of urban sustainable development. Okay, in other words, this isn't just that simple message of social, ecological, and economic. It's very clear that what we mean by urban sustainability now has much more to do with the interplay of complex systems and the way that cities drive those dynamics. That's the first thing. The second thing we need to be able to do is we need to be able to look at what those triggers are, whether they're priorities or catalytic forces about what makes for change. In other words, we've got to identify what will unleash the step change in urban governance that we require if we are to address planetary challenges as well as the kinds of socioeconomic challenges that are right up against us. The third thing, it seems to me, that we have to be able to do is we need to have some clear messages back to the global governance community, not just to city leaders or to national leaders about what to do. And we have to be able to deliver those messages in a fairly clear way. Most obviously through the UN system, but also through associated multilateral structures like the G20 or the G7, and arguably even the G77. And then associated with that, and we will not get any of these if we do not make that last thing, which is we've got to confront the realities of a change in the political balance of power and the demographic balance of power, and we have to foreground the conditions and the players and the issues of the global south. And once we're able to do those things, it seems to me, I'm sorry, that's rather small, but I believe that we can make this available, and this is the last slide, in order to address conditions of urban crisis, not just in a city, but in the system of cities and in the way that the urban plays into the overall conditions of the planet. It is absolutely fundamental that we galvanize responses at every scale. Failure to do that and failure to actually provide a substantial, robust evidence base means that we will miss the opportunity of dealing with the urban and the urban future at a time of global crisis. Thanks.
And now we have our discussant, who is Trudy Harpham, who will hopefully provide us comments. I'm not sure how this goes. Maybe people have questions. Il y a des questions pour ceux pendant qu'on attend pour while we wait.
Yeah, thank you. I utilize this time. Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Suzanne, for this wonderful, I would say, a conceptual understanding of urban, which is more required as in comparison to the all experimental studies that we are doing these days. So my question is from the study that I do. Generally, it is about peri-urbanization in India. So how far we are to consider the peri-urban space into urban science? Because as you said, the four fundamental things that are very important, and most of them are related to the complexities reshaping urban boundaries. So I think like how far we are to consider it, because it's a space where rural and urban both intersect, and I think cities are not independent from urban. So if you can throw some light on it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So it's such a good question, and it's such an important question. I'm going to fudge my way through it, and not because, but in a good way, I hope. One of the really good things about the data revolution and the fact that we can now be so much more specific about the spatial dynamics of data and so much more flexible. In other words, that we don't require surveys that either are representative of a metropolitan area or not, and where there's a very clear boundary with a sample, etc. And we can use much smaller data sets, is that I think, and we can track that over, we will potentially be able to track that over time, is that one of the barriers to the study of peri-urban areas, those really significant places, which are sometimes more dense even than what goes on in the suburbs. It doesn't follow that they are low density, but they are outside of the formally recognized administrative boundaries, and so are not always recognized as urban. One of the barriers to their study falls away. In other words, we can see them. So that third point I was making about what does urban science allow us to do, and it allows us to see places we never saw before. India is not unique. If you went to Tanzania, for example, and looked at somebody like Claire Mercer's work on peri-urban settlement of middle-class people, not just of poor people. recognizing that actually states don't always lead urbanization. Quite often people lead themselves and services follow people rather than the other way around, becomes possible to know and understand. And getting to grips with that and understanding whether those places remain peri-urban or whether they change over time becomes possible. I think the second thing which is possible now is not to have what used to be, I don't know, it's true in India as I think as much as it is of much of Africa, which is that the debate about urban versus rural used to be very polarized. And you either believed in the urban or you thought that the urban was overstated and you pushed for a focus on other kinds of things. And I think the political recognition of both and not either or helps a lot. What has shifted particularly though in the urban discussion is just as historically understanding that the nature of agriculture and food production was fundamental to rural society. I think the climate change discussion has made us realize that how cities are built is much more than urban themselves, and we cannot ignore it. So that applies as much to the peri-urban, and as I say, my answer, I hope, is that it's both and I think those are ways that will advance it. But I wouldn't want to conflate it with the idea that cities are important in and of themselves. Yeah.
And I think now we can turn it over to Trudy for a few minutes and then take more questions.
Okay, sorry about the bad connection. Not sure what happened there. Thanks, Sue, for a very stimulating talk. There are several things I could pick up on. Just to tell you a little bit about myself and therefore my perspective. I'm a PhD urban geographer, but I then worked in demography for a while, and then for most of my career worked in urban health. But I'm kind of wearing a demographer's hat today. So greetings from Switzerland, by the way. I'd like to focus on three things that Sue brought up, and it's really asking ourselves, what skills do we need to respond to the challenges that Sue has identified? What skills do we, as scholars, as demographers, need? And I'm going to just pick up on three things. Firstly, skills in research translation. Secondly, skills in multi or interdisciplinary work. And thirdly, skills in political science. So the first one, I'd like us to ask ourselves, how good are we at research translation? Research translation is sometimes called different things. It can be called getting research into policy and practice, GRIPP, GRIP, research translation. Sue emphasized that we have to engage with policy experts. How good are we at doing that? I would argue that demographers are not so good at that as compared to some other disciplines. You can disagree with me. Secondly, Sue talked about multidisciplinary research. And she said that it's sort of at one end of the interdisciplinary, the other end of interdisciplinary. What we've had decades of calls for more multidisciplinary research, interdisciplinary research. What do we really mean by that, and how do we do it? And again, as demographers, how good are we at doing it? Whereas Sue used the word multidisciplinary research, I think we need to move ourselves more to interdisciplinary research. And one characteristic I would identify as belonging to interdisciplinary research is where we develop common conceptual or theoretical frameworks. It's not just about getting a demographer, a geographer, a sociologist to be co-author of a research paper or co-PIs of a research project. It's really going beyond that and coming up with new shared frameworks. Are we able to do that? How good are we as demographers at communicating with and collaborating with other disciplines and making ourselves go that one step further to think about shared conceptual frameworks? So that's another set of skills that we need as demographers. And the third skill is really about understanding politics. How much do we engage with political scientists? How much do we understand about the power relations to influence these agendas that Sue has identified? I think we're fairly bad. I think some other disciplines are a bit better at understanding political science, studying political science. I think all demographers should have, level 101 of political science. I don't know if you do these days, perhaps you do. But those 3 sets of skills, I would say, are needed to respond to the agenda, to the challenges that Sue has identified. Research translation skills, interdisciplinary skills, and the skills to understand political science. So I just wanted to leave you with those 3 thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Trudy, for joining us from Switzerland. Do we have more questions from the floor, or perhaps?
No, I really like those points that Trudy makes. I would cluster those and say that they almost together make up in what we might think of as an urban disposition, where you've got to think like a city. You've got to think across what differences are going to make in practice. Who else do I need in order to do this? And I think what Trudy is saying about the political science is sort of, how does this actually work in practice? So maybe it's not just political science. Maybe it's also sometimes urban engineering. How does it actually, what is the nature of construction, as much as kind of what's the nature of regulation and who's going to enforce it? Or perhaps it's also anthropology or politics in the sense of, and who's going to object to it? I don't have to remind people living in Paris that the politics of stuff is as important as the technical recommendations. So yeah, and that's that. If you take those 3 things together, which I think Trudy articulated so well, how does this change our urban disposition for the 21st century?
And how does it change how you, as demographers, population scientists, work?
And I think it's what I think Trudy didn't say, and English is, maybe you would have had to, I don't know, in another language, is, are you using the singular or are you using the collective? In other words, is it you as an individual demographer, or is it communities of practice? Is it collections of us? So, and perhaps it's both and, but what does that actually mean in terms of the curriculum, the professional societies, the learned societies, certification, what are we actually putting in place, as well as what do we actually go and say when we get to go and talk to global policymakers.
Thank you, Sue. Do we have other comments from the floor? I know that IUSSP, the project that she's been part of, has been trying to work with, has been pretty successful with some of the urban fellows getting involved with urban policymakers and talking about their research results, looking at what communities need, for instance, in terms of access to family planning, and trying to get that integrated more into urban policymakers program.
This is a very general question, but I feel like in a lot of disciplines, we always have discussions around interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity, as well as how to reach policymakers. And I feel like, because it seems to me that problems are always the same, like how to communicate clearly, how to communicate effectively, and how to get the message across. And I feel like we're just as a scientific community, continuously grappling with these issues. So I was wondering if you have any kind of ideas or suggestions in terms of concretely, how do we get around that issue? Should that be integrated in undergraduate degrees, somehow communicating across different disciplines or different scientists communicating to policymakers, or at least PhD level, or how do we actually get around this problem that we seem to continue to have for many years?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because if you think about the last decade, maybe even more, that very strong focus on what we might think of as the last kilometer of intellectual knowledge. And in a way, it's almost distorted, either because that's all some people have done, or because other people just say, I can't be bothered, it's not my terrain, actually unimportant. And I think what Trudy was speaking about in terms of translational knowledge is what is much more common in fields like medicine, where in fact the entire intellectual project is reconfigured to ask the question about how do you effect the change that we need. So it's a much stronger normative base, okay? And it accepts a stronger normative base than we have typically been comfortable with. But it does at least leave scholars doing what scholars are good at, which is asking fundamental questions, setting out to find some really good empirical evidence, working out whether that is robust or not, and then actually dedicating it and leaving other people to get on with what they may do. But what it prevents is that mismatch where it's not an anti-blue sky research statement at all, but that sense of somehow somebody else will make that translation, or the translation is unimportant, or getting into a particular track of change is so important that we forego everything else in the research process, that we abandon research ethics, research methods, research integrity. And we have seen both of those things. I think if we're honest, we've absolutely seen both of those things. And I think what's being said here is actually we do need new knowledge. We need new knowledge about how do we manage the peri-urban, okay? Which means we've got to ask some pretty there's primary work to be done. But that is an applied question in the sense that we actually want to make some changes. We may decide it's more important to put services in rather than afterwards. We may decide that in order to ensure active democracy, we need to have a different kind of electoral system that recognizes people who live in those settlements. We may decide that building regulations have to be national, not local. Those are very applied questions, and they affect the nature of the question of what do we mean by the peri-urban. They're not just simply using the peri-urban as a case. And so I think it's that translational, for me at least, shifting to an intellectual agenda that is inherently translational, gets us some way along and doesn't abandon the link between research design, methods, and data. I don't know if that helps.
There's also a question in the chat from Susanna Adamo.
Susanna's here.
And the question in the chat is, what would be the role of citizen science / stakeholder involvement or co-production of knowledge?
Yeah, thanks, Susanna. I don't know, are you there? Hello. And I'm not sure where you are at the moment, so when you're asking that. I mean, I think part of what has been the excitement of citizen science, again, over the last, and of co-production, over the last 20 years, has been the recognition that there is expertise outside of the conventional places where knowledge was embedded and imbued. And that's particularly true in the global south, where, in fact, institutions of higher education and learning are much thinner on the ground, resources are much less concentrated in those places, and quite a lot of real intellectual leadership lies in communities and in practice. And so I think for universities, there's been that kind of wake-up call of incorporating that and augmenting that. And perhaps I should have said, and I note your question, and I will go and amend it on that slide. When we think about the different forms of knowledge that we bring together, the spatial, the statistical, I think that notion that there are other forms of embedded knowledge that we can legitimate and use to triangulate, to draw together and create a more holistic picture. I think for me, that's the role of citizen science. I would stop, however, before saying citizen science trumps all other science. And again, I think we actually have seen some of that. And because citizen science is quite often very local, it depends on voluntarism, it depends on an active community, it depends on an engaged local leadership. It doesn't always travel as well as it can. It isn't always comparable in ways that we need. And so it is necessary, but not sufficient, okay? We need more than simply that co-production and collaboration with communities. So I'm sure there would be an easier conversation. If you come in if you want to. I don't know how you do that online.
Maybe
yeah, I think maybe others in the room also. Yeah.
Thank you for your response. I am in New York.
Okay. Hello, New York. So really difficult. I mean, what's so nice about that question, though, is that it points to some of the real difficulties. You know, this stuff is not easy. You know, where do you study? Who do you study with? You know, whose interests are you serving in your study? These become, and that's I think what Trudy was saying, is that we do have to create that alternative disposition that incorporates rather than negates those kinds of questions. It's not just about numbers.
Just to bring in as an example, some of the fellows, they received training in policy communication and engagement. And when they were presenting the way that you would present at the PAA or at an IUSSP international conference, where you have a nice table with all of your results and your P-scores, is not something that you can present to a policy audience. So you really have to, one of the things was just teaching people how to present their work differently for different audiences so that they would have more impact. And it's simple things, but they're not things they think about. And the way that you would present to a non-researcher or a policy audience isn't necessarily valued within your discipline. I was thinking of Ketio, who's an economist, and you know, they would never present that way in a professional conference, but she's learned to be much, much more effective in terms of getting her point across to a policy audience about her research and what it implies for a policy, from a policy perspective. So, and I don't know if that's done here much in France or not, so it would be interesting. I don't know what experiences are with that. Mm-hmm.
There's another question. It's actually a comment from Trudy, Harpham. We might have to be willing to give up our disciplinary basis, become urban scientists. We may.
And Trudy, that's an interesting question, you know, and when do you give up that identity? Do you keep, I know there are lots of universities which are challenged by that. Do you create new programs in urban science? Or do you say, there's Trudy back, or do you say, we'll have undergraduate programs in engineering, and then we'll have master's programs where people integrate those sorts of questions. So there I think are some very real professional kinds of questions. I mean, the danger, as you know, more than you've done different entry points into the stuff, is that the urban issue itself is quite complex and multifaceted. And then you have to go and speak into another audience, like Trudy speaks into the health community. You sort of need to know the urban and you need to know the health stuff. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Trudy, as opposed to if you were going into the water sector, for example, you know, but I don't know, you've done that. Maybe you could.
Yeah, I feel we have to be brave about losing our disciplinary bases. I remember when I was at the early stage of my career, so I'm talking 25 years ago, one of my professors, at that stage, I was wandering between geography, demography, health. And at one stage, one of my professors said to me, Trudy, you're in danger of losing your disciplinary base. And I said, good. And it served me well. It served me well. And of my 35 PhD students, probably over half cannot identify a single discipline that they belong to. But they're all doing great stuff and wonderful researchers contributing to policy. And I think I'm not suggesting that we all do that. Obviously, you have to be willing to be, in English, there's a phrase, jack of all trades and expert at none. And I probably am one of those Jacks or Jills. And I think we need more people who can move between the disciplines, who can talk to different sectors. We've talked about multidisciplinary, but those multidisciplinary people tend to be able to talk across the sectors, to be multi-sectoral. And Mary Ellen has referred to our Gates-funded IUSSP project on urban fertility and family planning. And I know online there are some of our fellows watching this presentation, and many of our fellows have begun to build that skill, have that skill to talk to different sectors. They're by and large demographers. They are now building those skills to be able to talk in an influential way to the urban sector. So I think we have to be brave and loosen our disciplinary shackles. Over.
There's a comment actually from some of the fellows. Emeritus Chidonga, I'm sorry about the pronunciation.
You got it.
Thanks for the opportunity. Indeed, the training on policy communication using diverse methods has been very helpful and has made it possible to meet or communicate with policymakers in places where they are found. I was thinking about the question about losing our disciplinary basis. I don't think there's a lot of structural support for it currently. So I guess kind of like an inherent experience of demographer is that you work with people who come from different backgrounds and you end up working with people who don't fit categories really neatly. And sometimes they really struggle finding jobs because jobs, if you want an academic job, they're usually in departments that are kind of based in a discipline. And we should, like, if we want more people to kind of lose that pay space, then we would need more jobs basically that are designed for people like that. I think otherwise it's going to be, people are going to be struggling at the PhD level.
I think both of those, I mean, it is possible to hold two truths. We need more interdisciplinary people and there are incentives for being in your discipline. Just to highlight one thing though, is that I think the world is, one of the things which is changing is that the platforms that we can use for publication are changing. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I think a lot of the so-called specialist areas are themselves increasingly aware of the need to have urban expertise. So, you know, energy would be a good example. You know, whereas 20 years ago, if you were working on energy modeling, you were looking at long-term mitigation scenarios using national data, okay? If you were lucky, you had a demographer on your team making comments about family size and income distribution, but you were very fortunate. It is inconceivable now that you would work on energy modeling without looking at downscaling, okay? And the same is true of climate, and the same is true of biodiversity, and the same is true of water modeling. So, and because I think the recognition of shifting consumption and shifting demographic structures and shifting spatial patterns has been so profound, I think we may be in a situation now where you don't have to be a forerunner like Trudy was, where you actually said, I'll manage, don't worry about me. I think what the bigger challenge nowadays is not so much being invited to the party, it's what you say when you get to the party. And so there are openings for people to be urban and to speak urban, but you do need to know what it means. And so I would go back to those 3 points that Trudy was talking about earlier about how do we create what I call this disposition. You know, how do we think about a translational knowledge agenda? How do we do so in a way where we may not control all of it ourselves from our discipline, but where our disciplinary perspective has traction and merit, okay? Whether you are a qualitative or a quantitative or a historian or a futurist, but you've got something to bring to the party. And then how do you actually work in ways collectively that is more than the sum of the parts? Okay, that you, in other words, that you're not just perpetually doing an anthropological critique, which is to say, you know, well, yes, well, when I actually land up in this engineering project, it doesn't work because the people don't see it in that way. How do you actually take account of that in a formative rather than a summative kind of assessment? And that seems to me to be the challenge. And to do that, you've got to think about cities and their future. No pressure on the anthropologists.
No, I wasn't taking it that way. Obviously, that a lot of that applies not just to people working in urban, but across many areas.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So.
Other questions from the audience or comments based on your own experiences, maybe? Sorry, this is in English or French. We could do it either way.
No questions in the chat either.
I know we don't see the chat from here, so.
Okay. I mean, just to say that I don't think any of this is easy, and nor does it mean that everybody has to do everything. I think it can feel quite overwhelming at some point, but I think there is a difference between saying, I do this part of the recipe, but the whole meal is being constructed in lots of different places, and I'm aware that I'm not everything. Yeah, and I might even be doing my part of the meal in relation and in collaboration with other people. It's still not everything, but having an awareness of that does shift a little bit how you understand when you have to deliver, what you have to deliver, how distinctive what you have is in a particular kind of way. And I think understanding that distinctiveness can sometimes be really important. So without being a disciple for your discipline, you can nonetheless know that what you hold is fundamentally important. And I often think of history in this way. It's such a valuable discipline in the sense that they have the capacity and the opportunity to look back and reflect at why things changed, when they changed, what the contributors to change were. And that's enormously valuable. Most of us don't have that in our disciplinary inquiries, but we would think it's valuable, you know. And so to embrace what you have and can bring. So if it's a very particular demographic expertise, I mean, I'm not a demographer, but I would argue that the demographic question has not been foregrounded adequately in understanding the urban over the last 20 years. And it's for that very reason that we missed the rise of the global south, that we do not understand the nature of the youth bulge and the aging bulge and how those things come together, that we have no understanding of the changing nature of families, and we only tangentially aware of what some of the fertility dynamics are in real places and in real times. And that's before we've even got onto questions of migration and urbanization. I mean, these are fundamentals that should be at the forefront of every urban policymaker and every national treasury and all the global financial systems and all the banks that are investing our pensions, and they're not. And we have to ask why.
So basically you're saying is that as demographers and population researchers, they just haven't gotten the message across and how important the research they're doing is to solve those questions.
Yes, to know how important you are and speak loudly.
Yeah.
Which is funny because demography as a discipline exists because government needed information about the population, then we can't get the message from.
Yeah.
It is a problem.
It's sort of tangential, but I have a discussion with a friend of mine who's a doctor, and we walk. And we were talking about, well, there's a shortage of doctors all over in France, and it's not well distributed. And the fact is that they didn't train enough doctors. And he kept going, but they kind of have an idea of what the population is going to be in the future. And it's all centrally done. But why didn't they think of, well, we're going to need this number of doctors for the population in this year because we're going to have this many elderly people, et cetera. It was something that you could project. And why doesn't it get done? I mean, there's political reasons for that, but it seems like it's a place where you as researchers have fundamental information that's important for planning, future planning for governments. Okay. Where are we? Oh, we have a couple minutes. No, but thank you so much, because it's a really, I mean, it's interesting to get insights, I think, from someone who's not within a discipline to say how you can do things differently and where it fits in with other areas and an outside perspective.
Just one last thing on that. And it's interesting, I said I am a geographer, but I work quite a lot on planners. I study what planners do. And I think a little bit like demographers, planners have been kind of left out in the cold, and partly because planners themselves put themselves outside of spheres of influence by saying, oh, we did a terrible job, we messed up everything, there were consequences for things we did which we didn't anticipate, all planning is bad. And there's been a bit of a retraction from that. But what planners have, urban planners I'm talking about, have really not yet begun to do is ask exactly the kinds of questions that they need to be asking in concert with demographers. That sort of, where are we going? What will we need? Where is that going to be? You know, who is going to, what are the implications of that shift in significant kinds of ways? And it seems to me that by having two of the fundamental futurist disciplines marginalized from mainstream intellectual decision-making has left us all in a very, very much poorer place. And so some of what we're saying is about the specifics of the city, which challenges that, because it's one of the big things that we didn't keep our eye on the ball on adequately. But perhaps the solution is not just about a focus on cities. It is also a focus on the nature of the professions and what it is that they contribute to.
Just one last question in the chat. From Leela Chabane. How do urban studies present and future technological developments without losing the epitome of the studies?
Without losing?
The epitome of the studies.
Yeah, I mean, well, some people would argue that technology may be the driver of cultural and identity revolutions in cities. I'm not sure that they are necessarily the nadir. Technology is not necessarily the nadir of intellectual innovation and of personal inspiration. But I think one of the things which we do need to be able to do, and again, this is beyond our purview probably, but is to recognize where technology lies in the city. And sometimes it's in places that we don't imagine. So we write quite often about, no, actually, the HR payroll systems, or the way you pay your bill for your waste removal, or the way the lights go out in the cloakrooms is now all done by technology. And it shapes a lot of how we act, and not least because I now go to like this on the loo. It keeps the lights on when you're in your office and you have to tell the lights that you're there. You can't sit and think quietly, right? Do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. The lights go down, energy-saving lights. For those of you who aren't in this part of the world, when you sit still and quietly, the lights go off because they're run by technology that says there's not a person in the room anymore, when actually there is. And I suppose it's that thing of kind of, you know, understanding what technology does and where it's good and where it's problematic. And not losing the political edge on taking some control over that.
Anything more? Or we're about, oh, we're over a little bit over time now. So thank you so much, Sue, for coming here from Bristol.
Thank you, and my apologies for speaking in English the whole time.
Wow,
Pardon.
Okay.